The holding bay on Varath 6 smelled like every other Conclave processing station I'd been through. Recycled atmosphere with a faint chemical bite. Underneath. The kind of smell that means the filters are working but not working hard. And somebody a long time ago decided that was good enough. The chairs were designed for bodies that weren't mine. So I sat on the edge of the one nearest the door and put my bag between my feet and let Rook settle on the floor beside me. Rook was 11 years old. He'd been 11 for about 6 months now, which meant he was moving into the part of life where every month feels like you're watching a clock you can't wind back. His muzzle had gone the color of old ash, gray from nose to eye, fading at the edges, the same way good wool fades when you've washed it enough times. His ears still swiveled on instinct when something moved, slower now than they used to. His eyes were clear. That hadn't changed. His eyes were always going to be the last thing to change. I had a paper cup of something the vending unit near the corridor called Black Roast, Origin Blend. It tasted like neither of those things. It was hot and I'd been sitting in that bay for 4 hours, so I drank it. The transit form on my datapad said processing hold, auxiliary animal, classification pending. I'd been through 8 Conclave transit hubs in the past 3 years, and I'd had some version of that notation on my paperwork at 6 of them. It wasn't always the same phrase. Sometimes it was companion species, category review. Once it was non-standard biological accompaniment, which I thought was creative. But it always meant the same thing. It always meant we were going to be sitting in a room while somebody decided what to do about Rook. I'd retired from the K9 Handler Corps 11 years before, which meant Rook and I had retired at almost exactly the same time. Him from active service, and me from the Corps that ran it. He'd come home with me in the same transport, and he'd slept at the foot of my bunk for the 3 weeks because neither of us had figured out the new geography yet. He didn't know where the safe spots were, and I didn't know how to tell him there was no more perimeter to run, no shift change coming, no handler rotation. We figured it out eventually. He took the left side of the bed. I took the right. We made do. The first time a Conclave checkpoint held us up was 4 years old, and still carried himself like a loaded weapon. Low center of gravity, all the attention in the world behind those eyes. Kind of controlled alertness that made checkpoint staff nervous, even when they didn't know why. I'd had to explain then that he was a retired military working dog, that the harness with the patch on it was a retired service harness and not an active one, and that the patch said retired in large text if anyone cared to read it. Nobody ever cared to read it at first. Now he was 11 and gray-muzzled, and he lay on the floor of the holding bay with his chin on my boot, and breathed at a rate that suggested he had already made his peace with the concept of Conclave processing stations, and found them unremarkable. I had not made my peace with them, but I was working on it. The processing bay held about 20 other travelers. Most of them were Conclave species, tall, narrow-shouldered van in transit robes. A cluster of Oarathi near the water dispensers doing what Oarathi always did in waiting rooms, which was stand very close together and speak in ranges I couldn't hear. 2 humans at the far end, a man and a woman, nodded at me when I came in and hadn't spoken since. Standard transit crowd. The people you share a room with for 3 hours. And then forget completely. The Conclave processing officer assigned to my hold was a Vane named something I couldn't pronounce, so I'd been calling him the clerk in my head, which wasn't generous but was accurate. He was tall, even for a Vane, with the deep gray scaling that meant he was older than he looked. And he wore his processing corps insignia on a chest sash that had been laundered too many times, told me he'd been stationed here, long enough for the uniform to start giving up. He'd processed my transit documents twice, queried the auxiliary animal code 3 times, and gone away to consult his supervisor twice more. Each time he came back, he looked at Rook on the floor, and then at the paperwork, and then at me, and each time his expression did the same thing. It started with mild professional skepticism, ran through something that might have been uncertainty, and finished at a kind of careful non-commitment, the look of a bureaucrat who has spotted a problem he'd prefer to forward upstream. The classification for this animal type, he said the last time, setting the datapad on the table between us, requires a formal taxonomy review. Companion species in Category 7 or above require assessment before transit clearance can be issued. He's Category 4, I said. It's on the form. Retired service animal, domestic accompaniment class, handler bonded. Same form I've filed at 6 other stations. Those stations may not have applied the updated Conclave Annex, the clerk said, the careful tone of a man who has just discovered a regulation he can use, and intends to use it all the way to the end. The Vereth 6 station protocol requires independent confirmation for K9 designation animals above Category 3. K9 is the designation for the handler core unit type, I said. It doesn't correspond to the Conclave category scale. They're different systems. They've always been different systems. Nonetheless, the clerk said, which is a word that functions as a full stop in a conversation. He picked up the data pad. We will arrange an assessment. It should not take long. He walked away. Rook watched him go. Then Rook put his chin back on my boot. I finished the coffee. The assessment team arrived 40 minutes later. By that point, I'd gotten a second cup of the coffee and eaten a protein bar from my bag, and Rook had shifted position twice, once to put his head in my lap, and once to sit up properly with his back straight and his ears forward, which was his tell. For having decided the room was worth paying attention to again. There were 3 of them. 2 were security staff in the standard Conclave Transit Corps kit. The flat matte gray body panels, and the helmet rigs that gave them a silhouette, like angular question marks. The 3rd was the clerk, who'd acquired the expression of a man who had completed a bureaucratic task and was now waiting to see whether that task would cause him further difficulty. They has a 4th figure with them that I hadn't seen before. It was tall. That's the first thing. And tall in a way that doesn't come from species. It was tall the way that something that has spent a long time being the largest thing in any given room learns to carry itself, which is like water. Like it had filled the available space, and the space had decided not to complain. It moved in a way I recognized, because I'd seen something like it in Rook 10 years ago, when he was young, and at the front of his abilities and the world, was always exactly as wide as he needed it to be, everything held in reserve. Nothing wasted. It was roughly bipedal. Its coloring was deep red-brown, the color of dried clay in good light. And it had a low ridge of something along the dorsal line that might have been bone or might have been armor, the kind of feature where the distinction stops mattering. Its eyes were set wide, and they were pale, almost colorless, and they moved the way Rook's eyes moved, which was with the specific economy of something that had learned to track targets by not moving its eyes at all, and instead moving everything else. I found out later this was called a thresh. What I knew in the room was that the security staff were giving it about 2 feet of space on all sides, which they were doing without appearing to notice they were doing it. The clerk was 3 feet back. The thresh itself didn't appear to register any of this. It walked to the center of the processing bay, and it stopped, and it looked at me. Then it looked at Rook. Rook was sitting up by then. He was looking at the thresh. His tail moved once, a slow half-arc, kind of wag that isn't excitement and isn't nervousness, and isn't the big full-body wag he used to do when I got his leash out. It was the wag that meant he was paying attention, and he'd decided to be patient about what happened next. The thresh did not move. This, clerk said, from his position 3 feet back, is Conclave Apex Assessment Officer. Under Annex 17 of the Transit Code, it has the authority to reclassify companion species in cases of disputed categorization. All right, I said. The assessment will determine whether your animal presents a threat profile above the standard domestic companionship threshold. He's 11, I said. He has a gray muzzle. He's been sitting on my boot for 4 hours. The clerk nodded carefully, which meant he had heard me and was choosing not to engage. The assessment will proceed. The thresh took 1 step forward, took no steps at all. He sat where he was. His ears were forward. His eyes were on the thresh. His tail moved again, the same slow half-arc, absolutely unhurried, absolutely unconcerned. The thresh stopped. It was about 8 feet away now. The security staff had both moved, very slightly, further back from it, not from Rook. From the thresh, I noted that. The room had gotten quieter than it had been. Not the quiet of nothing happening. The other kind. The kind that happens when a lot of people in a space simultaneously decide to be very still. I could hear the ventilation. I could hear the Oarathi near the wall, who had stopped talking to each other. I could hear Rook's steady, unhurried breathing. The Thresh stood there. Rook sat there. I drank my coffee. Here is what I know about Belgian Malinois that most people don't know, including most of the people who've stood in rooms with them. They're not big dogs. When you see them beside other working breeds, the shepherds, the retrievers, the big mastiff-type dogs, they look almost slight. Medium-sized, lean-muscled, a build that reads as athletic but not heavy, and in repose they can pass for an ordinary dog if you're not looking carefully. A lot of people aren't looking carefully. What careful looks like, applied to a Malinois, the eyes don't stop. Even when the dog is still, even when the dog is relaxed, even when the dog has his gray-muzzled chin resting on your boot and is technically asleep, the eyes note every movement in the room. Not with the high-frequency anxiety of a nervous dog. With the low, sustained, cold attention of something that has been making probabilities assessments since, before you walked in and has already filed several conclusions about you. The Corps used to say that the difference between a working Malinois and other working breeds wasn't drive or trainability or physical capability, though those were all there, all present in abundance. The difference was what the dog did with the space between actions, the downtime. Most working dogs fill the downtime with energy, because the drive that makes them good at the work doesn't switch off cleanly, and what you get is a dog that paces or vocalizes or redirects, burning off what it can't use. A Malinois at rest inverts that. The drive turns inward. It becomes attention. The whole engine, idling, pointed at the room. Rook had been doing this since he was 10 weeks old. His first evaluator in the Corps puppy program wrote in her assessment, "Subject displays unusually sustained environmental surveillance posture. Recommend close observation, either a washout or exceptional. No middle outcome likely." She retired before he completed his service years, and I wrote to her when he got his Class 9 score, and she wrote back a one-line reply that said, "I had a feeling." Rook had been formally assessed by the K9 Corps Evaluation Board at the end of his 4th service year, which was the standard assessment for handlers requesting a second service term extension. The Evaluation Board rated him Class 9 on the Conclave Equivalent Threat Taxonomy, which was the score they gave him using the Conclave's own rubric applied to Earth working dog standards. Class 9 on the Conclave rubric meant presents a sustained lethality profile consistent with Apex tier designation under standard engagement parameters. The form on my transit document said Category 4, because Category 4 was the civilian domestic code for retired service animals, and that was what he was. He was retired. The category was accurate, it just wasn't the whole picture. The whole picture was that Class 9 on the Conclave evaluation rubric was the highest classification their system assigned to biological companions. Above Class 9 they used different language. They stopped using the word companion. Rook had been Class 9 at 4 years old. That was 7 years ago. I'd never told the Conclave that part, because they hadn't asked correctly, and I didn't see the need to volunteer it. If you file a Category 4 form and it gets accepted, it gets accepted. I wasn't lying. I was answering the question that was asked. There is a difference between a lie and a correctly answered narrow question. I learned that distinction in the Corps. Forms are narrow by design, and the people filling them out learn early that the form asks what the form asks. The form asked whether the animal was a retired service companion bonded to a certified former handler. Category 4, domestic accompaniment class. He was. I answered correctly. The fact that his evaluation file, stored in the Corps archives under a classification-sensitive header, contains a score that doesn't sit comfortably alongside the word companion is not something the transit form asked about. So, I didn't put it on the transit form. The Thresh was still standing in the middle of the processing bay, was still sitting on the floor beside me. One of the security staff shifted her weight. The movement made a small sound, and Rook's ears swiveled toward it, and then back to the Thresh, in about a quarter second, without the rest of him moving at all. The security staff stopped shifting. I should tell you about the Thresh, because the record I read later, when I finally filed the incident report with the Corps Liaison Office, described it in clinical terms that were accurate but not complete. The clinical description said, Apex Assessment Officer, Conclave Biological Classification Corps, certified for Tier 1 through Tier 5 threat evaluation, capable of independent threat profiling with a verified assessment accuracy of 97.4% across 11,000 recorded evaluations. Assigned to high-priority cases where standard instrument-based classification has returned ambiguous results or where the assessed subject has demonstrated resistance to standard classification protocols. Clinical description did not say was that threshes are what the conclave uses when everything else has already tried and failed. They are not a first option. They are not a second option. They exist at the end of a sequence of options, after the sequence has run out, and their function is to look at the thing at the end of the sequence and tell the conclave what it is. They are very good at this. They are very good at this because they are themselves in the apex tier. Not the apex tier of the classification system, but the apex tier of the actual taxonomy, which is a different thing. They've been doing threat assessment since before the conclave had a formal taxonomy. The taxonomy grew up around what they were already doing. In 11,000 assessments, a thresh had declined to complete an assessment twice. Both times were classified incidents. I found out about them later. I am not going to describe them here because this is my account and those incidents involved other people and are not mine to describe. What I will say is that when a thresh declines to complete an assessment, it does not file a form. It does not issue a written classification. What it does is lower its head and step back. I didn't know any of this at the time. I knew that the thresh had been standing in the middle of the processing bay for about 6 minutes, and that it had not moved since taking the one step forward, and that the room around it had continued to get very quiet, and that the clerk was no longer standing 3 feet behind it, because the clerk had, at some point in the past few minutes, moved to the far side of the bay near the exit corridor, without appearing to have made a decision to do so. Rook had not moved. His tail moved again. Same slow arc. Same patient rhythm. He was looking at the thresh the way he used to look at his food bowl while I was getting his dinner ready. Not hungry. Not anxious. Just noting the situation with the steady attention of something that has decided it can wait. The thresh's pale eyes were on him. I've thought about what happened in those minutes more times than I can count, and I keep coming back to the same thing. What the thresh was doing was the same thing Rook was doing. It was reading the room. It was doing the work it had been brought here to do, which was to look at the thing being classified and draw conclusions. And it was doing that work, and the conclusions it was drawing were producing a result that it had not been designed to produce and did not have a category for, because Rook was doing the same thing back. That's the part I think about. Rook was not being evaluated. Rook was evaluating. He was doing what an 11-year-old Class 9 working dog with 7 years of active service does when something new comes into its space. He was reading it, filing it, and deciding what it was. He'd decided within the first 30 seconds. He'd moved on from that, and was now simply waiting for the room to catch up. The thresh, I think, was having a longer version of the same experience. 53 minutes into the assessment, I had a watch. I was keeping track. It was something to do. The second security officer leaned toward the first one and said something quietly. The first one replied just as quietly. Neither of them were looking at Rook anymore. They were looking at the thresh. The thresh lowered its head. It was a slow movement, deliberate. Capitulation exactly. I've watched animals all my life, and I know the difference between submission and acknowledgement, and what the thresh did was somewhere else entirely from both of those. It was the movement of something that has completed an evaluation and is communicating the result by the only method appropriate to the result, which in this case was not a form, and not a classification code, and not a full report. It was a nod, if you want to use a human word for it. Something in the region of a nod offered once, and then the thresh took one step back, and then another, and then it turned, and it walked toward the corridor on the far side of the bay, and the security staff moved out of its way without discussion. Rook watched it go. When the thresh was gone, Rook sighed, the big, settled sigh of a dog that has been keeping its attention somewhere, and has decided it can let that attention go now. He lowered his chin back to my boot. The two security officers looked at each other. The clerk was somewhere I could no longer see. The Oarathi near the wall had not moved for the past 40 minutes, but they were moving now, sidling quietly toward the corridor in the other direction, doing it without urgency, the way you move when you don't want to draw attention to the fact that you're moving. I got up and went to the vending unit and got a third cup of the coffee. When I came back, the processing bay had fewer people in it. Not empty. The two humans at the far end were still there, and a few of the Veen in transit robes, but fewer. The clerk came back 11 minutes after the Thresh left. He'd recovered something of his professional bearing, though it was the kind of recovered that involves a certain amount of careful reconstruction. He had my transit documents on the datapad, and he set them on the table in front of me with the practiced gesture of someone completing a routine task. "Your classification review has been completed," he said. "The assessment has returned a Category 4 confirmation. Transit clearance is approved. Standard domestic accompaniment, handler bonded." "Good," I said. "You'll need to sign the updated companion manifest." He turned the datapad toward me. "Standard form," I signed it. He picked up the pad. He looked at Rook for a moment. The kind of look that is trying very hard to be professional and is managing it but only just. Then he looked at me. "May I ask," he said, "how long you've had the animal?" 11 years, I said. "He came home with me when we both retired. The clerk processed this. He was a service animal. Canine Corps. 7 years of active service. Handler companion, handler protection, threat assessment support." I paused. He was good at the last part. The clerk looked at Rook again. Rook was asleep or close enough to it that the distinction didn't matter practically. His breathing was deep and even, and his tail moved in a very small, slow arc that meant he was dreaming about something. "Yes," the clerk said. After a moment, "I imagine he was." He walked away. I folded the transit documents and put them in my bag and sat for a while in the now much quieter bay, finishing the coffee, letting Rook sleep. The transit to Vareth 6's departure platform was a long walk through corridors that were designed, Conclave standard bodies, and were therefore slightly too wide and slightly too low for my comfort, which meant I walked with my shoulders adapted and my neck down and my bag in one hand and Rook's leash in the other. Not that Rook needed the leash. He walked at my left heel the way he'd always walked there, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him, and his nails made a quiet, even tick on the floor with every step. The leash was a formality we'd maintained for 11 years because the alternative was explaining to every transit checkpoint that a Belgian Malinois without a leash is not an escaped dog. It's a dog that doesn't need one, and that conversation takes longer than just wearing the leash. So we wore the leash. It was red nylon, faded from years of being clipped and unclipped, and it connected my hand to a ring on his collar that he hadn't needed since he was 2 years old, and we both understood this and neither of us commented on it. Conclave transit corridors move a lot of people at once, and I passed a lot of people in those corridors. Most of them flowed around me the way transit crowds do. A few of them did something different, to notice Rook and then not notice him, in the specific way that means you've noticed something you've decided not to engage with. Gian, in official transit robes, who passed us going the other direction, looked at Rook for a half-second too long, and then looked away very quickly. More distance between himself and the wall we were walking beside. 2 Warathi ahead of us on the corridor rounded a junction, encountered Rook coming the other direction at about 10 feet, and stopped. Not the stop of something confrontational, the stop of something that has encountered a signal and is waiting for its nervous system to interpret it. We passed them at normal walking pace. Neither of them moved until we were well past. I didn't comment on any of this. I don't comment on it in transit corridors anymore. There was a time, earlier in my years of traveling with Rook, when I used to notice this happening and feel something about it. An irritation, kind of low-level defensiveness, the feeling that we were being read wrong and I should correct the reading. I'm past that now. The readings aren't wrong. Rook is what he is. He's gray-muzzled and 11 years old, and he walks at my left heel, and he dreams about things when he sleeps, and he puts his chin on my boot in waiting rooms. He's also what he was for 7 years before any of that, and those two facts exist together in the same dog without the contradiction. He doesn't think about the contradiction. Stopped thinking about it too. It's just Rook. The departure platform was a long, open bay with a curved ceiling and a row of transport berth gates down one wall, and a view through the far window of the Verith 6 docking ring and, beyond it, the slow rotation of the station's outer arm. I found my berth gate, confirmed the departure time, sat down on a bench that was slightly more comfortable than the processing bay chairs, and got out my datapad. Rook sat beside me. After a moment he lay down, facing outward from the bench between me and the open platform floor. This is what he always did in transit areas, facing outward, watching the movement. Not anxious, his body was completely loose, his breathing at rest rate, the very picture of a retired dog who had nothing left to prove and no reason to hurry, but facing outward, always facing outward. I used to try to redirect him, early on. Get him to face the window, face the gate, face somewhere less deliberate seeming. He'd comply for about 30 seconds and then orient back to the platform floor. After the third or fourth transit hub, I stopped trying. He was going to face the room. That was just how he sat. A Conclave military officer passed the bench at about 20 feet out. Not core transit security. Proper military, gray and gold rank insignia on the shoulder panels, on the Conclave scale, put him in mid-officer territory. He wasn't looking at us. He was looking at his own datapad, reading something. The automatic navigation of a man who'd walked these corridors many times and didn't need to think about them. He passed our bench, and then he stopped. He looked up from the datapad. He looked at Rook. Rook looked back at him. The officer stood there for a moment. He had the build of someone who'd spent a long time in serious work and had the posture to show for it, and he looked at Rook with the expression of a man who has just experienced a recognition he wasn't expecting. Not fear, not the professional alarm of the security staff in the processing bay. Something more specific than that. Something that looked, if I had to put a word to it, like respect offered to a colleague you've heard about but never met. He gave a small nod, toward Rook, toward me, and then he walked on. I watched him go. Rook watched him go too, and then turned his gaze back to the platform floor and sighed. There are people in the core liaison network who've spent years trying to get a formal Conclave classification agreement worked out for retired K9 units traveling with former handlers. I was part of those conversations for a while, after the fourth time we got held up at a processing station, because I was annoyed enough to put my name on a filing. The conversations went the way those conversations go, which is slowly, and then not at all. And after a while, I stopped putting my name on filings and accepted that this was going to be the way of it. That Rook and I were going to sit in, holding bays on every other transit hub we went through, and I was going to drink bad coffee, and eventually someone was going to come and look at him. And then there was going to be a long pause, and then they were going to let us through. That's not a solution. That's just a description of what happens. The solution, as far as I can see it, is that the Conclave needs to update its taxonomy. The category system was written by committee, and it was written by people who were classifying things they'd assessed, which means it only includes things they'd already encountered and successfully filed. Rookworth doesn't break the category system. He just sits at the edge of it, in the gray area between Category 4 and whatever comes above the top of their scale. The system looks at him and runs out of boxes. You can argue this is Rook's problem, in the bureaucratic sense. You can also argue that a taxonomy that runs out of boxes when it encounters a retired gray-muzzled working dog on his way home from a transit stop is a taxonomy with a problem. I know which argument I find more persuasive. What I also know is that this is not a new problem. The Conclave's classification system has been running out of boxes for Earth-working animals. Since the first handler-companion pairs went through Conclave transit hubs, and the response every time has been to file a special review, convene an assessment, and eventually produce a piece of paper that says Category 4 and move on. The Category 4 designation is accurate in the sense that Category 4 is the civilian domestic code for handler-bonded retired service animals, and that is what Rook is. It just also describes golden retrievers. I'm not going to tell you a golden retriever and Rook are the same thing, because they're not. I've had dogs all my life and I have nothing but affection for the whole species, and particularly for Goldens, which are the dogs that figure out how to love you so completely that you forget they're a separate creature. Rook has never been that dog. Loves me in the specific, fierce, practical way that dogs love the person who is their handler. Not the soft comfort love, the working love, the love that is also attention and also loyalty and also the decision, made early and kept every single day since, that your survival is a priority he intends to maintain. That's a different thing. But to the Conclave's category system, you file a 4 and you move on. We were an hour out from departure when the second thing happened. I'd been reading, had been doing what he always did, lying facing the platform floor, breathing evenly, ears occasionally rotating toward a sound, and then back to rest. The platform had filled in around us with the usual pre-departure mix of travelers, a good 4 or 5 dozen people, and a handful of alien species spread across the benches and standing in the gate queues. Group came in from the main corridor at the far end of the platform. There were 7 of them. They wore the transit workers' gray, that means ground crew or loading staff, and they were moving with the specific purpose of people who have a job to do and are doing it, not travelers, just workers crossing a platform. They were a mix of species, 3 Ven, 2 humans, 2 I couldn't name from this distance, and they walked together in the loose group of people, work the same crew and know each other well enough not to need to talk constantly. They passed about 30 feet out. Rook lifted his head, not with the fast urgency of an alert, with the slow, interested raise of a dog noticing something worth noting. His ears went forward. His eyes tracked the group. His body stayed loose, the weight low, the breathing unchanged. The group kept walking. One of the humans at the far edge of the group, a woman, mid-40s, the build of someone who does physical work and has done it for a long time, turned her head. She was looking at something else, not at us. And then she wasn't looking at something else. She was looking at Rook. She stopped walking. The rest of the group kept going for a few steps before noticing, and then they stopped too, with the minor disruption of people who weren't expecting a stop and are recalibrating. The woman was looking at Rook, not with fear, not with the professional alarm I'd seen in the processing bay. She was looking at him with the expression of someone encountering a thing they weren't prepared for and aren't sure yet how to process, and the processing was happening visibly, right there on her face, the sequence of it, recognition, recalibration, something that might have been awe. Rook looked back at her. She said something to the person beside her, one of the Vane who looked, and then also stopped moving with any urgency. I didn't move. I kept the datapad in my hands, but I wasn't reading anymore. The woman took a few steps toward us, which she did with the deliberate care of someone who has decided to do a thing and is going to see it through, wants to be thoughtful about how. She stopped at about 12 feet. "Is that a K9 unit?" she said. "Retired," I said. She looked at him for another moment. "What was his classification?" 9, I said. She was quiet. The Vane behind her was quiet. Down the platform, a few of the other travelers had noticed the stopped group and were looking over, not because anything dramatic was happening, but because groups of people stopping and looking at something is one of the oldest signals in the world. "I worked loading at the Austrian hub for 6 years, the woman said, eventually. "We had K9 units through there on rotation during the treaty negotiations. I was there when one of them stopped a veteran border security team in the secondary corridor." She paused, stopped them completely. Nobody gave an order. Nobody fired anything. The dog just walked out in front of them and stood there. And the team leader, he was rated class 7 on the Fethen-Ren threat scale, which is the second highest they have, just stopped. And then the whole team stopped. "That sounds about right," I said. She looked at me. The dog was just standing there. "Yes, not growling, not doing anything." "No," I said. "They don't have to." She looked at Rook again. Rook's tail moved, the slow arc, the patient rhythm. He was looking at her with the soft attention of a dog who has decided she's not a problem and is now simply being polite. "He's beautiful," she said, with the simplicity of someone who means it. "He is," I said. She went back to her group. They kept walking. A few of the other travelers who'd been watching went back to what they were doing. Rook put his chin on my boot. His name was Rook because when he'd first come to me as a young dog, still in training, still running hot with all that unformed energy that Malinois puppies have before the work shapes them, he used to sit and watch the room from whatever the highest point was. Not anxious high, not looking for escape routes. Surveillance high. The elevated position of something that wants to see all of it at once. The full picture. Every corner. One of the trained in the handler program called him Rook as a joke. The chess piece, the castle, the one that controls whole lines of the board from a single position. And it stuck, because it fit. And names that fit tend to stick. He was never a showy dog. I've had handlers in the Corps tell me their Malinois were operatic about it. All the intensity worn on the outside, coiled spring energy visible from across a room. Rook wasn't like that, he went quiet. The intensity was there. If anything, the evaluation board thought it was higher than most. But it sat underneath, in the stillness, in the way he looked at things, and if you didn't know what you were looking at, you might read it as calm. It is calm, that's the thing. It's not calm instead of intensity. The intensity is what the calm is made of. I've tried to explain this to people over the years, and it doesn't always land, because it sounds like a contradiction. A dog that is extremely intense does not look like a dog that is extremely calm. In most people's experience, Rook is the exception. He has just directed all of it inward, the way good athletes direct it, the way old soldiers direct it, the way any creature that has operated at the edge of its own capabilities for long enough eventually learns to direct it. Still water, deep current. You can't see the current from the surface. The Thresh had seen it. That's what I keep coming back to. The Thresh had been brought in because it's the Conclave's last word on threat assessment, the instrument they use when everything else has run out of answers. And it had walked into the room, and it had looked at Rook, and Rook had looked back at it, and in 53 minutes, the Thresh had arrived at a result that made it lower its head and step back. I've thought about what the result was. I don't have formal access to the assessment record. It's classified, as I understand it. Though I've heard that the classification isn't quite the right word for what happened to it, that the file exists in an unusual category in the Conclave's taxonomy database, something they created specifically for this case, and haven't used since. I don't have access to it. What I have is what I observed, which is this. The Thresh came in. The Thresh looked at Rook. The Thresh stayed in the room for 53 minutes looking at Rook. Then it lowered its head and stepped back. Here is the thing about a classification system. Classification system exists to tell you what something is. It sorts the known world into categories, so you can predict how things behave, what they require, what they're capable of, and what to do about them. A good classification system has a category for everything. A perfect classification system would have a category for everything that exists. The Thresh's function is to complete the classification process for the cases the system can't handle on its own. It is the end of the line. It looks at the thing that can't be filed and it files it. What happens when the thing that can't be filed also can't be filed by the thing that files the things that can't be filed? I think the Thresh answered that question, not in words, not in a report, in the specific grammar of an apex creature communicating with another apex creature, which is, I see you. I have completed my assessment. My assessment is that this does not go in a box. Rook had understood that. He'd understood it 11 years ago when they gave him his Class 9 score, and he'd understood it for 7 years in the field, and he'd understood it on every transit platform and in every holding bay. And he understood it in that room when the Thresh stepped back, and he'd responded to it the way he responded to everything, which was with one slow tail wag and then his chin on my boot. It doesn't go in a box. Is fine with that. He's known it for a long time. The transport to our next destination was a mid-range Conclave carrier, the kind they use for civilian transit on the inner routes. Functional, not comfortable, built for throughput rather than experience. I had a double berth because I'd booked 1 year ago and paid for it every transit since, because it meant Rook could sleep on the lower bunk without me having to file a special accommodation form. The first time I tried to let him sleep on a standard single berth, they'd sent a steward to tell me that the animal accommodation regulations required separate sleeping provision. I'd told the steward that I'd paid for a double berth and that separate sleeping provision was exactly what I'd arranged. The steward had looked at Rook and then at the berth and then said that he'd note it as resolved. We've used double berths ever since. The carrier departed on time. I sat in the berth with the light on and read for a while, And Rook lay on the lower bunk with his head on his paws, and watched me the way he watched me when I read. With the patient attention of something that doesn't understand what reading is, but has decided that if I'm doing it, it must be worth watching. After an hour, I turned the light down and lay on my bunk and listened to the carrier's hum. Is the white noise of transit, and one of the sounds I've come to associate with the specific piece of being between one place and another, belonging to neither, responsible only for getting from here to there. Rook's breathing slowed and deepened. He was dreaming within 15 minutes. His paws moved in the small, rapid way of a dog chasing something in sleep, the tiny muscle twitches of a body running somewhere it isn't. And then he settled again, and the dreaming smoothed out, and he lay still and breathed. I don't know what he dreams about. I used to think about it more when he was younger, when the dreams seemed more urgent, the paws moving faster, the occasional low sound from somewhere in his chest, the eyes moving under the lids. Now the dreams were quieter, more settled. The dreams of a dog who has finished the part of his life where the urgent things happened and is now sorting through the archive of them, putting them in order, deciding what they meant. Maybe that's too much to project onto a dog's sleep. Maybe he's just eating balls from somewhere in his own head, and I'm reading into it. But I've watched him sleep for 11 years, and the shape of his sleep has changed the way the shape of a person's sleep changes over a long life. And I'm not inclined to dismiss what I see. He's earned his dreams, whatever they are. I've read the incident report from Varath 6, now that I've had time to file for access. The incident report describes a processing anomaly in the Biological Assessment Wing, Category 7 review, involving a retired Earth K9 designation companion animal and a Class 1 Apex Assessment Officer. It notes that the assessment was conducted 53 minutes and terminated without a classification result. It notes that the subject animal was reclassified at Category 4, original classification confirmed, and transit clearance was issued. It notes that the Apex Assessment Officer was stood down from active duty for a period of 72 hours following the assessment for what it calls evaluative recalibration, which is the phrase they use for when a thresh needs time after an assessment. The report does not explain why a thresh requires evaluative recalibration after assessing a retired domestic companion animal. The report does not ask the question. I think in the bureaucratic tradition of reports that decline to ask the questions that lead to answers nobody particularly wants filed, that not asking the question was a decision, a practical one. The kind of decision that processing stations make every day, which is that some things are easier to classify and move on from than they are to explain. Rook is Category 4. He's handler bonded, retired service, domestic accompaniment class. He's 11 years old, and he has a gray muzzle, and he sleeps on the lower bunk, and he puts his chin on my boot in waiting rooms. The thresh stepped back. The report calls it an anomaly. I call it Tuesday. We transferred at Orvesh Station 3 days later, which was the next transit hub on our route home, and went through processing in 40 minutes, with no hold and no assessment. Standard companion manifest, Category 4 confirmed, transit clearance issued. The processing officer who handled our paperwork was a young Vane, new to the station by the look of the uniform, who looked at Rook with the open curiosity of someone who hadn't developed the professional non-expression yet. What breed, she asked. Belgian Malinois, I said. She looked at her datapad. I don't have that breed in the companion species register. It's an earth working dog, I said. Medium size, short coat, usually used in law enforcement and military working dog roles, historically. We were K9 Corps together. She looked at Rook. Rook looked back at her. His tail did the slow arc. He seems very calm, she said. He is, I said. He's always calm. She stamped the manifest and handed it back. We went through to the departure platform and found a bench, and I got a coffee from the vending unit. It was better than the one at Varath 6, which wasn't saying much, but I drank it anyway, and Rook settled beside me and oriented toward the platform floor, and we waited for our departure. Platform was quieter than Varath 6. Smaller station, smaller crowd, the easy pace of a hub that processes steady traffic rather than bulk put. Through the far window, I could see a corner of one of Orvesh's orbital docks. A long line of berthed freighters and mid-range carriers under the cold light of the system's star, which was white and distant and cast everything in the flat, shadowless way that outer system stars cast it. All detail and no warmth. Watched the platform. I drank the coffee. After a while, a child appeared at the edge of our bench area, maybe 8 years old. A vein, which at that age means big, curious eyes, and the rangy proportions of a species that grows into its frame slowly. All legs and not much of anything else yet. The child was with an adult who was trying to steer them toward the gate cue with the universal technique of adults trying to steer children somewhere, which is patient redirection, applied repeatedly with gradually diminishing patience. The child was not interested in the gate cue. The child was interested in Rook. Rook noticed the child. He raised his head. His ears went forward. His tail moved. Not the slow measured arc of the assessment mode wag, the bigger one. The whole body gentle sway of a dog that has decided the new thing in the room is good. The child said something in Vian I didn't catch, pointing. The adult said something back, quieter, steering again. The child looked at me. Is that your animal? Yes, I said. What is it? A dog. An earth dog. His name is Rook. The child looked at Rook. Rook looked at the child. His tail was still doing the big wag, the generous one. His expression, if you want to call it that, was the open, interested expression of a dog that likes children and has always liked children and has never had a reason to change that assessment. The adult said something firm in vain and put a hand on the child's shoulder. It's all right, I said. He's friendly. The adult looked at me, then at Rook, then back at me with the evaluating expression of a parent running a quick and pragmatic risk assessment. Rook's tail was going back and forth like he was trying to move air. The adult let go of the child's shoulder. The child covered the distance to Rook in about 3 steps and crouched down and put both hands in the fur at the sides of Rook's face, which is the move that children always make with dogs, the immediate whole-face contact. And Rook did what he always did when a child did that, was to be completely still and accept it, and then to lean into it very slightly, and then to sigh. The adult watched. The calculated wariness was still there in their expression, the responsible carefulness of a parent who is watching an unknown large animal make contact with their child. And then, over about 30 seconds, it did what it always did, which was to lose the calculation as the animal in front of them kept doing nothing, except accepting affection from a small creature with total patience. The child talked to Rook in vain. I don't know what they said. Rook's ears moved. He was listening. Eventually, the adult said something, and the child gave Rook one more pat and stood up, and they went to the gate queue. Rook watched them go. Then he turned his head and looked at me. I know that dogs don't have expressions, technically. I know that what I read in a dog's face is a projection of my own social cognition onto a different species' face, and that it would be inaccurate to say that Rook looked at me with a particular expression, and mean by that something equivalent to what it would mean if a person looked at me with a particular expression. I know all of this. What I also know is that after 11 years I know every state his face has in it, and the state it was in when he looked at me after the child walked away was the state I've always privately called content. Not happy, not excited, not the operational calm of the assessment posture. The other thing, the quieter thing. The thing that I think is what it looks like when a dog that has spent 7 years being the most focused and lethal and carefully controlled instrument in any room it occupies, and then 3 more years gradually becoming just a dog, sits in a transit hub with a child's hands on his face, and decides that this is also a good thing to be. I scratched him behind the ear. Just not something I could have done easily when he was 4 years old and sharp-edged with all of it. Now he leaned into it and his eyes went half closed and he made the low sound that means it's good. Keep going. We sat there until departure. Home was an agricultural station on the far side of the junction, one of the smaller Earth-adjacent habitats that had gone up in the first generation of expansion and had been quietly getting on with producing food ever since, without much fuss and without much fame, kind of place that isn't anywhere anyone would specifically aim for, but which turns out, if you end up there, to be almost exactly the right size. I had a quarter plot and a prefab structure, with a good view of the cultivation fields, and a neighbor 400 meters down the path who left me alone except when I wanted company, which was the correct frequency of neighbor. I had a porch with a bench on it. I had a kitchen that worked. Liked the porch. He liked it because it was elevated slightly above the surrounding ground, which gave him a clear line of sight in 3 directions. And because, in the evenings, the wind came off the fields and brought the smell of the crops, soil, and the things that lived in the soil, and he could sit there and track all of it without needing to move. Surveillance high. The elevated position. Same as always, just quieter now, the whole board visible and nothing urgent on it. I was on the porch the evening we got back, 3 days after Vareth 6, and Rook was sitting beside me with his chin on the porch rail, watching the fields go gold in the low light. And I was drinking something better than vending unit coffee and thinking about nothing in particular. The incident report had filed itself. The Corps Liaison Office had acknowledged it and noted it for the ongoing classification review file, which was the file where incidents like this went to wait until someone decided to do something with them, which might be soon and might be a decade from now and might be never. That was fine. I'd filed what I needed to file. The Thresh had stepped back. The room had gone quiet. We'd gotten our clearance and gone home. I've been through a lot of transit hubs. I've sat in a lot of holding bays. I've drunk a lot of bad coffee, while somebody somewhere decided whether Rook was what the paperwork said he was. Every single time, eventually, I've gotten the clearance and gone home every single time. I don't think that's going to change. Rook's tail moved. The slow arc, patient rhythm, the 11-year-old gray-muzzled wag of a dog who has been through every version of that room and come out the other side of all of them, and is now watching the fields go gold in the evening and has decided that this, here now, is the room worth sitting in. The star went down behind the cultivation rows, he sighed. We sat there until dark.